was used, the Dead Sea has a 28% concentration or solution of sin, which is salt, right? And when God speaks about, you are the salt of the earth, I've heard many sermons about this passage, this excerpt, and every time I hear a sermon about this, it's always about talking about flavoring, how Christians are different from the world, and how Christians add flavor, or salt is, in this context, it's used as a preservative or as flavoring. But actually, I've recently just learned something new about this verse, so I wanted to bring it to your attention. I wanted to share it with you guys. So when it says, you are the salt of the earth, Matthew chapter 5, it doesn't explain this verse, what Jesus means entirely, it doesn't explain it explicitly. That's why I went to Luke, it explains it a lot better. Because in Luke chapter 14, verse 34 to 35, it says, salt is good, but if the salt has lost its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is neither fit for the soil. So the emphasis here is the word soil. And in Matthew, when Jesus mentions or talks about you're the salt of the earth, it actually, earth means the word soil. And what Jesus is saying here is that we are the salt of the soil. And why I say soil is because soil, back then, Gentiles, Jews, people who lived in that demographic area, they, one of the ways they acquired salt was by going to the Dead Sea. And in the Dead Sea, there happens a process, but I'm not going to explain the scientific process right now. But what happened was that they went there and they would go there to scrape up salt, because there would be a crystallized form, crystallized layer on the Dead Sea, and they would go and scrape up the salt. And they would go and use it. When salt was used in these days, salt was primarily used for being a fertilizer, and it was to fertilize soil. Now, what the soil needs to flourish and to grow plants, if you're a gardener, you would know, but you would use something called NPK, which is, N is for nitrogen, P is for phosphorus, and K is for potassium. And there's something called potash, which is potassium chloride. Well, potassium chloride, this is the thing that Jesus was referring to. Potassium chloride, when they would use it, they would put it, they would use it as a fertilizer and put it to the plant. And that way the plant would, first of all, develop the roots, and it would grow the leaves, and the plant would flourish and grow much larger than a regular plant without a fertilizer. And what it was used, so once the fertilizer comes in direct contact with the soil, with the dirt, it cleans and it cleanses, it cleans everything around the soil so that the plant can flourish. And this is something that's very intricate, because when I heard many sermons about it, it was always talking about flavoring Christians. Somehow Christians are the museum of society. But when I learned about it from a different perspective, which is that actually with potassium chloride, and Jesus was referring to about being salt of the soil, is that Christians, us Christians, we are different from the world by being in direct contact with the dirt, with the soil, and cleaning everything around it, being influencing our environment. Now, salt doesn't influence the environment by saying anything or doing anything. It's simply by being the substance. Now, when God said, or when Jesus said, that how can it be made salty again? And if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is neither fit for the soil nor for the manual potter, and it is thrown out and trampled under the feet by men. Now, what God means by loses its saltiness, salt physically cannot lose its a substance that cannot lose its chemistry. It's physically impossible for salt to lose saltiness. But for Jesus to speak about it, it must have happened during the times that Jesus was here. And the reason why he was referring to this is because when women of the Jewish women or any type of a woman would go and scrape up salt from the beach or from the Dead Sea, they would also scrape up a lot of sand along with it. So when the salt would be mixed in with the sand, this was obviously a very tactic by people who would sell salt and try and profit from it. But when they would scrape sand and they would be mixed in with a bunch of other substances, it would then lose its compound. It would lose its physical properties because no longer is now being used as salt. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up today is because I feel like it has been increasingly difficult to become a Christian in modern society and today's world, because the wave is constantly being against you. We've seen a lot of social trends where they have gone wrong, and they're not being used to glorify God. They're not being used they're not being used to. Sorry, my mind's trying. When these social trends, when they would come up, right, and we can see that Christians, if God mentions that we are the salt of the earth, then that means we have to adhere to the teachings of Christ, and that we have to be the embodiment of what Christ taught us. And that means that Jesus Christ is divine love individualized into human consciousness. And what this means is that when people will target Christianity and say that Christianity is just an ethics code where you will be saved by your own works or your deeds, then that's not true, because there would be no reason for salvation. There would be no reason for Christ dying on the cross for us. But the reason why we're different from the world is because Christ came and he died for everyone, not just his children, not just the chosen people who were the Jews. He died for everyone to have salvation. And a very famous quote that I heard is that the church, which is the lifeboat, should be in the sea, but when the sea goes into the lifeboat, then you're in trouble. And being different means that we're no longer ruled by sin or the order of the world, but we are transformed by one act from a single man, which is Jesus Christ. And since we are not bound by the principles of community, because salt alone, if you take a single grain of salt and add it as a fertilizer, it's not going to have its full effects. You need a handful, maybe quite a couple of handfuls for salt to have its effect as a sort of fertilizer. And that's why I feel like us Christians, we should be together, and we should not judge one another, not pick up each other if someone makes a mistake, if someone does a fault, that we should be there for each other because we are the image of God. And if we are to go out there in the world rather than being in our comfort zones, I think that's where we can make the biggest difference. And one thing that us Christians are also different about is that we are seen living in higher standards. What I mean by higher standards is not we live higher standards as in materialism, but we live higher standards as in morality. Christians are seen to have higher standards in morality because the world today, it loves people who are boastful, who are prideful, who are pride in spirit. And we Christians, God taught us to be poor in spirit. And poor in spirit does not mean to not have self-confidence. I don't think that's what it implies, but being poor in spirit means that your self-confidence comes from Christ, and your self-confidence means that when you go to God And you tell him, God, this is something I simply cannot do without your help. And this is what it means to be poor in spirit, is that you're not prideful in your own works, you're not prideful in your own confidence, but actually you're submitting to God and you're allowing God to give you his strength. Yeah.
I already done.
They're pretty much done.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Round of applause now. Thank you.
So Sandra said that like 2 hours.
Yes.